If you want something changed, it is your responsibility to present a prima facie case. Prima facie is Latin for at first sight. You can also think of this as at first face or at first glance, or any number of ways. Remember that in argumentation, a prima facie case is one that, upon first reading or hearing it, essentially at first sight, is sufficiently constructed to at least temporarily suspend the presumption for the opposition. In other words, it is a case that, based upon first impression, can be accepted as correct until proven otherwise. You'll recall that the affirmative, the team or the person advocating that something in the status quo needs to be changed, is responsible for presenting a prima facie case. In policy debate, this means that the affirmative has to prove that there is something wrong with the status quo. A harm or a problem exists that the status quo is either causing or allowing to exist, and they have to provide a means to fix that problem, a solution or a plan. Now let's turn to the negative or the opposition. Anyone who opposes a prima facie case once presented has the burden of rejoinder, meaning they are required to respond reasonably to or refute the issues presented by the affirmative. Refutation, then, is the process of discrediting someone's argument by revealing weaknesses in it or by presenting a counterargument. Alternatively, it requires the open expression of disagreement with an argument made by someone else. The bottom line for you is, when you are opposing someone else's proposal to change the status quo, whether it be a formal policy like changing the public transportation system, or something more informal like let's not stay at home this year for the holidays, you have the responsibility to not only make your own arguments, but address the other person's arguments as well. You cannot ignore their arguments and only offer your own. This video lecture will focus on defining refutation, the classifications of refutation, and some strategies to refute an affirmative case. For the purpose of this video, we will use the term affirmative to mean someone or a group who is advocating a change in the status quo, and negative to refer to someone or a group who is supporting the status quo, essentially opposing the affirmative's case. Before we go too far, let's be clear about the difference between the burden of rejoinder, capital T, and the burden of rejoinder, lowercase t, or a burden to rejoin. It's very similar to the burden of proof and a burden of proof. Recall that the affirmative has the burden of proof to overcome presumption. If they don't sufficiently prove that there is a problem with what is happening now and that their solution will work, then the negative, or the status quo, doesn't even have to say a thing. Some proposals, for example, are so ludicrous that no one will give them serious consideration. This is the requirement for the affirmative to have a prima facie case. But anyone who offers an argument, affirmative or negative, has the burden to prove that argument, especially if pressed. He who asserts must prove. The same holds true for the negative and the burden of rejoinder. The negative must refute or rejoin or respond to the affirmative's opening arguments. It is the negative's burden to show the weaknesses in the affirmative's case. So the negative has the burden of rejoinder. However, the affirmative has the responsibility to respond to those arguments offered by the negative. They can't just keep repeating their own arguments and ignore anything the negative says. So while the affirmative doesn't have the burden of proof, they certainly have a burden to refute or respond to the negative's arguments. Let's turn next to classifications of refutation. First, we can differentiate them by purpose. If your purpose is to destroy or tear down the other's arguments, you are using destructive refutation, such as when you expose the fallacies in their arguments. However, if you decide to offer counter-arguments that can be weighed against the other's arguments, you are constructing your own case, using constructive refutation. If the affirmative is arguing that capital punishment is expensive, for example, you might respond that it is less expensive than life imprisonment. Bargaining is when you are providing middle ground, or compromise, between the case and potential counterarguments. In other words, you may accept some of the affirmative arguments that a harm exists, but show that those harms are not as bad as they claim. Or you can show that with just a little bit more work or a little bit more time, the status quo will be able to solve the problem, and there's no need for the affirmative plan. We can also differentiate refutation in terms of where it is applied. If you respond to a specific argument, you are engaging in specific refutation. However, if you have an argument that can be applied to the overall case, or have an extended argument, you would be engaging in case-level refutation. Using the capital punishment case as an example, if you were to argue that allowing dangerous criminals to live and enjoy shelter and 3 meals a day for free is worse than the unlikely possibility that an innocent person is put to death, you would be using case-level refutation. Let's go into a little more detail on case-level refutation. It's really the overall strategy about how the negative plans to refute the affirmative's proposal. When you are the negative, one way you can approach the debate is to directly refute or clash with the affirmative's arguments. If the affirmative contends that capital punishment is cruel and unusual punishment, you respond to that argument. If they also say that it doesn't deter crime, you respond to that argument. If they say that the appeal process is too expensive, you respond to that argument. Another option is counter-advocacy, often called a counterplan. This is where you basically agree with the affirmative that there is a problem, but you propose a completely different way to solve it. Let's use a different example, one that might happen in your everyday life. Your significant other is complaining that you are lazy and don't clean up after yourself, pushing for a schedule of chores that it's hoped you'll agree with. In counter-advocacy, you might agree that you are lazy, but instead of you doing the chores, you propose an alternative option of hiring a service to do the cleaning. Same problem, but different plan. Now what you will do is weigh the pros and the cons of each plan. These two, direct refutation and counter-advocacy, do not have to be mutually exclusive. You can combine them by attacking the specific arguments and at the same time offering a counterplan. The negative has the luxury of being selective in which arguments they respond to, so answer those arguments that you think you have the greatest likelihood of winning. Remember that the negative only has to win one of the major voting issues. If you can prove that there isn't a problem that needs to be solved, then there's no reason to engage in counter-advocacy. If you can prove that the affirmative's plan creates more severe problems than those the plan is attempting to fix or is unworkable, then you really don't have to spend too much time on the reason the affirmative believes the plan is necessary. You'll recall that a policy debate is set up to build a case for changing the status quo, as well as offer a plan to change it. Another way to think about refutation is whether it is addressing the case, the reason we need the change, or the plan, the proposed change. If you are trying to show that the affirmative's case that a problem exists and is caused by or allowed to continue because of the status quo, you would be attacking the case. If, however, you are pointing out that the affirmative's plan will not solve anything or will create more problems than it solves, you would be attacking the plan. There are different strategies for each of these approaches. But let's turn next to some specific strategies that anyone, not just the negative, can use to refute an argument. First is exploratory refutation. You don't always need evidence or examples to win a point. Oftentimes, just asking a question or raising objections may do the job. For example, you may ask, how many people does this really affect? Or how long will it take before the plan works? Or even, how much will this cost? This may cause your opponent to take a stand on some issues that you hope to refute later. This often works when there is little time for your opponent to respond, or if you ask a question that he or she hasn't considered. You can also point out any contradictions or inconsistencies, looking for claims that contradict each other. Oftentimes the affirmative case is set up so that if they win one argument, they lose another. You can't argue, for example, that you don't want to study because you find it doesn't help, and then say that the only way you can learn is through the repetition of repeating and rereading. Either studying doesn't help, or it does. You can't have it both ways. To use an idiom, you are on the horns of a dilemma. Another strategy is to test the evidence that is being used to support an argument. You might be able to show that it is biased, too old, from someone who is not qualified, or that no one else can find that evidence. If the evidence is bad or non-existent, that may mean that the argument is bad. You can also test the reasoning behind the argument, looking for fallacies and poor logical construction. If your opponent is arguing that lack of exercise causes obesity, you could question the causality link. Could it be, rather than lack of exercise, poor diet causes obesity? If the affirmative's plan to reduce obesity and the resulting costs associated with it is to increase the amount of physical activity in schools, then pointing out that there may be an alternative cause would offset the need to spend lots of time and money developing an exercise regime that may not be justified. Finally, you can use a constructive strategy, which is the direct refutation we talked about earlier. Provide some evidence that contradicts your opponent's evidence. Perhaps yours is more recent or from a more qualified source. And you can offer counter arguments. Maybe you have some better reasoning to refute your opponent's arguments. Now let's talk about two major strategies that work specifically when attacking the plan: how the affirmative proposes to fix or solve the problem. Both of these strategies require you to think about what would happen if the affirmative's plan were implemented. The first is a cost-benefit analysis. You are looking at the costs of adopting the plan. With any change comes risk, and with every change comes a cost, whether it be financial, emotional, etc. With this strategy, the negative will try to show that the risks of adopting the plan outweigh the benefits. Every plan has disadvantages or negative consequences. If you have allergies, for example, you may take medicine that causes drowsiness, a disadvantage of the plan to solve your allergy problems. To use another idiom, the medicine is worse than the malady. I'm sure you've seen a bumper sticker that says something to the effect of, "If guns are outlawed, only outlaws will have guns," which can extend to mean that if we adopt gun control, crime would actually increase because law-abiding citizens wouldn't be able to protect themselves. When you use the cost-benefit analysis, you try on balance to show that the negative side effects are more severe than the benefits of adopting the plan. The second method relates to feasibility. Will the plan actually work? When you examine or question solvency, you are asking what the likelihood is that the plan would actually solve the problem. Another way of looking at this is, does the plan meet the need the affirmative is claiming? In a gun control case, if the affirmative is claiming that people are dying because of handguns, a pretty significant harm, and the plan sets up a gun buyback program, will buying back guns really stop people from killing others? Wouldn't knives kill just as well? Related to solvency is looking for loopholes. How might someone circumvent or get around the plan? If the affirmative's plan is to buy back handguns so that they can't be used to kill people, will there be some people who don't turn them in, or turn in only 1 or 2 guns but hide the rest? In either case, if the plan won't solve the problem, why would we want to adopt it? How do you actually accomplish refutation? Regardless of if you're affirmative or negative, you should be making the following 4 types of statements, in order, in response to your opponent's contentions. First, identify your opponent's argument so that critics know which argument you're addressing. You should say, "Now on the argument that people are using guns in crime." Then if you have more than one response in the argument, you will number that response. Regardless, you provide a counterclaim, saying something like, "First," and then go through your first argument. Your counterclaim could be that your opponent's argument is fallacious, the evidence is old, the reasoning is flawed, you have evidence that proves otherwise, etc. The third step is to explain and support your counterclaim. Now you would explain why the argument is a hasty generalization. And finally, the fourth step is to impact your refutation so that we understand what it means. Now, if you have more than one counterclaim, you start again at the second step and go through the remaining steps again. Let's put it all together. Assume your opponent contends that the death penalty is less expensive than life imprisonment. Using this technique, you would say, regarding my opponent's first argument that the death penalty is less expensive, I have one response. The death penalty is definitely more expensive than life imprisonment. The excessive number of appeals costs the public far more in taxes than housing criminals. Think about all of your hard-earned money that will be wasted on court appeal after court appeal. This mitigates my opponent's cost argument, and it should have no weight in the debate. Processing time. What is the burden of rejoinder, and who has it? If your refutation is focused on pointing out flaws in your opponent's argument, what type of refutation are you using? What are 2 main strategies for refuting a plan? You should now have a much better idea about how to refute an argument, as well as how others might refute yours.